The moment Silas Crowe walked into Lenora Vane's shop, the whole town watched through the window not out of curiosity, but hunger. The kind of hunger that feeds on other people's pain. Old Hartwell, the mercantile owner, had already told half of Red Willow that the scarred seamstress was getting a charity husband. A man who lost a bet. A man who had no choice. He said it loud enough at the feed store that 3 women heard him and carried it further. The way bad news always travels faster than good. By the time Silas tied his horse to the post outside, the story had already been decided for them both, before either of them had spoken a single word to each other. Nobody asked Lenora what she wanted. Nobody ever had. If that were you, if the whole town had already written the ending of your story before you'd even begun, would you have opened that door? If this kind of story moves you, stay with us until the very end. Every scene matters. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. Tap that button and ring the bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The blizzard came without warning, the way the worst things always do. 1 hour the sky was a pale, colorless gray, the kind that hangs over Wyoming in January like a wet wool blanket. The next hour, Silas Crowe couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. He'd been moving the last of the cattle to the southern shelter pasture with Gideon Mercer when the temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of 20 minutes. The horses started pulling at their bits, ears flat, which was the only warning either man needed. Silas had worked Wyoming range long enough to know that when animals get afraid of the sky, you listen. "We're not making it back to the main house," Silas said. Not a question, just a fact delivered the way he delivered most things, flat, without drama, with the particular economy of a man who had been wrong before and knew what it cost. Gideon didn't argue. He never argued with Silas about weather. He argued about everything else: politics, cattle prices, whether a man could learn to love a place the same way he could love a person, but not weather. Weather was the one subject where 34 years of Wyoming had made Silas into something close to a prophet. They pushed the horses toward the old line shack at the northeastern corner of the Caldwell property, a structure so ugly and poorly built that the ranch owner, Edmund Caldwell, had long since stopped counting it in his inventory. 2 walls that didn't quite meet at the corner, a door that swung on one working hinge. A wood stove that had survived 15 winters through pure stubbornness rather than engineering. Perfect. They got inside just as the storm became something that had a name, or should have. Silas tied the horses in the lean-to, packed the gap between the door and the frame with his spare shirt, and got a fire going in the stove, while Gideon settled onto the single-sink cot along the far wall. That was when Silas noticed Gideon wasn't moving right. Not the careful stiffness of a man cold to the bone. Something slower, something that worried him more than the storm outside. "You're running fever," Silas said. "I'm fine. You're sweating through your coat in a shack that's 40 degrees. I said I'm fine, Silas. Silas pulled a chair close to the cot and sat down without asking permission, which was his way. He studied Gideon the way he studied everything, looking for what wasn't being said. Gideon Mercer was 41 years old, a big man with an easy laugh and the kind of face that inspired trust in people who met him for the first time. He had been Silas's closest friend for 11 years, which was remarkable because Silas had spent most of those 11 years actively resisting the friendship. Gideon had simply refused to take the hint. Now he looked small in a way that Silas had no framework for. "How long?" Silas asked. "How long what? Don't play dumb with me." Gideon was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind hit the shack sideways, and the whole structure shuddered like it was flinching. The fire in the stove popped and threw orange light across the room. 3 weeks, maybe 4, Gideon finally said. Started as something in my chest. Doc Heller and Laramie said it moved. Silas didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been either dishonest or useless, and he was allergic to both. "There's something I need from you," Gideon said. "Don't." "Silas, whatever you're about to ask me, I want you to think about whether you'd ask it of a man who wasn't trapped in a snowstorm with you, because if the answer is no, then you don't get to ask it tonight." Gideon actually laughed at that, a real laugh, short and rough. "That's fair." He shifted on the cot, and his breath caught for half a second, which told Silas more than he wanted to know. "There's a woman in Red Willow, Lenora Vane. She's a seamstress. We've been writing to each other for 8 months. I made her a promise, Silas. I told her I was coming in the spring. Told her she'd have a home." Silas was very still. "She has nobody," Gideon continued. "Her sister died 2 winters ago. She's alone out there, and she's been alone for a long time, and she believed me when I said I was coming. She made plans around that belief." He stopped. "Reorganized. She deserves better than a broken promise. Gideon, I need you to go in my place." The shack went so quiet that Silas could hear the fire breathing. "No," he said. "I know what I'm asking. You're asking me to marry a stranger. I'm asking you to give a good woman a fighting chance at a life she deserves. Those are 2 different things dressed up as the same thing." Gideon turned his head and looked at him directly. His eyes were too bright from the fever, and that brightness made him look younger, which was the cruelest thing about sick people. They sometimes looked like the version of themselves that existed before the damage. "You owe me your life, Silas. I've never called that in. Not once in 11 years. And there it was. Both of them knew the story without having to tell it. 7 years ago, a river crossing that went wrong and a current that had decided to finish something. Gideon had gone in after him without thinking about it, without hesitating, without calculating the odds. He'd gone in because Silas was his friend, and that was the entire sum of his reasoning. Silas had never been able to fully forgive him, for it not because he wasn't grateful, but because the debt sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't move or ignore. "That's not fair," Silas said. "No," Gideon agreed. "It isn't." Silas stood up and went to the stove and stood there with his back to the room. He could feel the heat on his face, and he could hear Gideon's breathing, which was wrong in a way that was getting harder to ignore. He thought about what he knew of himself, which was this: he had never loved anyone without losing them. His mother gone when he was 9, his father 2 years after that. A boy at the orphanage who had been the closest thing to a brother he'd had, dead from fever at 13. He had learned early and learned hard that attachment was just a word for the thing that hurt you when it was taken away, and so he had spent 34 years building his life around that lesson. Good work, reliable wages, a bunkhouse bed, and no one waiting for him anywhere. It wasn't a happy life. He'd made his peace with that distinction. And now Gideon was asking him to hand that particular armor to a stranger and stand exposed in the Wyoming cold. "Tell me about her," Silas said, without turning around. Gideon was quiet for a moment, and then he started talking. He talked about a woman who had built her trade from nothing, who had survived something violent and shameful he didn't give the details. And Silas didn't ask, and who had come out the other side carrying a scar on her face and a reputation for being difficult, when what she was, Gideon said, was simply unwilling to be small. He talked about her letters, which were precise and funny, and occasionally furious about things she felt were worth being furious about. He talked about the way she'd described the light in Red Willow in November, how it came through the window of her shop at a certain angle and made even plain fabric look like something valuable. "She sounds like someone who doesn't need rescuing," Silas said. "She isn't," Gideon said. "She needs a partner. There's a difference." Silas turned around. "What does she look like? The scar you mentioned." It was a blunt question. Most men wouldn't have asked it out loud. But Silas had always found that the things people danced around were usually the things that mattered most, and dancing around them didn't make them smaller. "It just made them harder to approach later. It runs from her left cheekbone down to her jaw," Gideon said, without flinching. "She got it from a man who thought she owed him something she didn't. She's been wearing it for 9 years, and the town has never let her forget it. And you fell in love with her through letters. I fell in love with who she is. The letters were just how I found her. Silas sat back down. He put his elbows on his knees, and he looked at the floor, and he thought for a very long time. Outside, the storm screamed and threw itself against the walls like it was personally offended by the existence of shelter. When he finally spoke, his voice was so flat it could have passed for indifference if you didn't know him. "I'll write to her after. Silas, after. When we're back at the ranch and you've seen Heller again and we know where things actually stand," because he wasn't ready to say dying. He might never be ready to say it. Gideon let it go. He closed his eyes. His breathing evened out a little, though not in the way of a man sleeping peacefully, in the way of a man conserving. Silas sat in the chair through the night, feeding the stove when it needed it, watching the door as if something outside might try to come through. By morning, the storm had broken. By the following Thursday, Gideon Mercer was dead. He went quietly, which surprised Silas in a way he couldn't quite explain. He had expected something more from a man who had been so alive. But there was no dramatic final scene, no last-minute wisdom. Just Gideon's breathing getting slower over the course of 2 days, until it simply didn't happen anymore, and Silas sitting in the chair beside the bed in the ranch house, holding a hand that stopped squeezing back somewhere around 2 in the morning. The ranch hands gave him space, which he appreciated. Edmund Caldwell said something appropriate, which Silas didn't hear because he was already somewhere else in his head, somewhere very far back where a river was running fast and cold, and a man had jumped in without thinking. He buried Gideon in the ranch cemetery, east-facing, which was where the sun hit first in the mornings. He didn't know if Gideon would have cared about that. He cared, that had to be enough. Then he sat down and wrote to Lenora Vane. He spent 3 days on that letter and threw away more drafts than he had written of anything in his entire life. He was not a writer. He was a man who could read a cattle contract and survey a pasture and fix a fence in the dark and read weather 3 days ahead by the color of the horizon, but he was not a man who put himself on paper easily. The first draft said too much. The second said nothing. The third tried to be gentle in a way that came out condescending, and he saw it and burned it before he finished. The fourth draft said plainly, "Gideon is gone. He spoke of you with great respect and great love. He asked me to come to Red Willow and offer you what he promised. I have no intention of deceiving you. I am Silas Crowe, 40 years old, a working ranch foreman with no wife, no children, and no romantic delusions. I am coming to Red Willow in 6 weeks. If you prefer that I don't, send word and I will honor that. If you are willing to speak with me, I will explain everything I can explain in person. I am sorry for your loss. He was the best man I knew." He mailed it, and then he sat with the silence it left behind. He had given himself 6 weeks to talk himself out of it, and himself 6 weeks to fail at that, which he suspected was the more likely outcome. Red Willow was smaller than he'd expected, and colder than seemed reasonable even for February. It sat at the base of a long ridge like something that had slid there and decided to stay. A main street with a mercantile, a livery, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of buildings that had been given optimistic names by their owners. The sewing shop was at the far end, set slightly apart from the others, with a painted wooden sign above the door that read Vane and Company Fine Sewing, and alterations in letters that were confident and slightly crowded together, as if she'd underestimated the space she'd need and then decided not to redo it. He tied his horse at the post and stood there for a moment longer than he needed to. He was aware, in a distant way, of being watched. 2 women on the opposite boardwalk had stopped their conversation. A man outside the mercantile had his hands in his pockets and his eyes in the wrong direction, which was Silas's direction. He recognized the specific quality of that attention. It was the attention of a town that had already decided what was happening and was waiting to see how closely reality would match their version. He'd spent his entire life refusing to perform for an audience. He went inside. The shop was smaller than the sign suggested and warmer than the street, which he credited to a cast-iron stove working at near capacity in the corner. There was fabric everywhere, bolts of it on shelves, folded lengths of it on a work table, swatches pinned to a board near the window. The smell was of dye and lanolin, and the particular kind of clean that comes from a place that is worked in honestly every day. She was standing at the work table with a length of dark blue wool in her hands. She looked up when the bell above the door rang, and she didn't move. She was 36. He would later learn, though she looked a year or two younger except in her eyes, which looked older than everything else about her. Her hair was dark and pulled back practically. Her dress was well made and showed no excess of anything, no decoration that didn't serve a function. She held herself the way a person holds themselves when they have been looked at too long by too many people who meant nothing kind by it, not hunched, not ashamed, but contained. Deliberate. The scar was exactly where Gideon had said. Pale against her skin now, long years past the rawness of new damage, running from just below her left cheekbone in a slight curve to the edge of her jaw. Not hidden, not displayed, just there the way a person's whole face is just there, not asking permission. She did not flinch from his gaze. She met it head on, and he saw in that moment that she had been doing this particular thing, meeting people's first look and daring them to make something of it for so long that it had become second nature. More than second nature, armor. He recognized armor. He had built enough of his own. "Mr. Crowe," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected, and he expected it to be steady, which meant she was even steadier than that. "Miss Vane." He took off his hat. "I brought Gideon's letter. The one he left for you. I know about the letter." She set down the fabric. "I also know what he asked you to do. He told you?" "He wrote to me the week before he died. He told me he'd asked a friend to come. He asked me to hear him out." She paused. "He didn't tell me his friend would be quite so." She looked at him plainly. Reluctant looking, Silas blinked. He was not accustomed to being read quickly. "I'm not reluctant," he said. "You stood outside for 4 minutes before you came in." He had no immediate answer for that. He filed it away as information she was observant, and she was not going to pretend she wasn't. "I was thinking," he said, about whether this was the worst idea I'd ever had or the second worst." Something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, more like the thing that comes before warmth recognition. The acknowledgement that she was being spoken to, honestly, for possibly the first time in a long while. "Sit down, Mr. Crowe," she said. "I'll put water on. And then you can tell me exactly what kind of marriage you think you're offering." He sat. She moved to the stove. The shop was quiet except for the sound of wind outside and the shifting of wood in the fire, and Silas realized that for the first time in 6 weeks, the stone in his chest had shifted slightly. Not gone. Nothing like gone, but moved. The conversation lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes by the clock on her wall, which he watched on 3 separate occasions, and she watched not at all, which told him something about the relative cost of the afternoon to each of them. She was not what he had expected, and he had tried very hard not to expect anything specific, which meant she was not what he had prepared for. She asked him direct questions about the ranch, about his wages, about the specifics of what he could offer and what he couldn't, and she listened to his answers with the particular attention of someone who was running the numbers in real time. She pushed back on 2 of his statements once when he described the arrangement as protection, which she corrected to security, and once when he implied she would want to stop her sewing work, which she shut down without raising her voice. "I'm not going to become someone's housewife," she said. "I do that work, but I do my work too. I wasn't suggesting." "You implied it. The word you used was settle. People settle into roles." "I don't settle. I build." He looked at her. "Then build," he said. "I'm not asking you to stop." She studied him for a long moment with those eyes that were older than the rest of her face, like she was looking for the lie in that statement and couldn't quite find it. "Separate room," she said. "I want that stated plainly." That was going to be my suggestion. Equal say in decisions that affect us both. "Agreed. If it doesn't work, we talk about it rather than pretend." "I've always found pretending expensive," he said. She looked at him again with that same analytical weight. and then she picked up her cup and drank from it and set it down and said, in a voice that was almost casual, except for the slight over-precision of the words, "My mother used to say that a woman who accepts a bad bargain deserves the bad bargain. I have tried for 9 years to believe she was wrong about that. I'm still trying." She met his eyes. This would be a bargain. "I won't dress it up as anything else, but it would have to be a fair one." "I'm a working man," Silas said. "Fair is what I know how to do." Outside, through the window of the shop, he could see old Hartwell from the mercantile had gained 2 companions on the boardwalk across the street. 3 people watching the window of a sewing shop as if something interesting was happening inside. He looked back at Lenora. She had followed his gaze and returned to him without commentary, which told him she'd been looked at this way for so long that even live witnesses didn't disturb her much anymore. "They'll talk," he said. "Whatever we decide. They talk when I eat breakfast," she said. "I've stopped organizing my decisions around what they'll say about them." He wanted to say something about that, about how rare it was, about how most people never got there, but it felt too close to a compliment she hadn't asked for, and he suspected she had a complicated relationship with compliments, the kind that comes from years of receiving them as preamble to something unkind. "I'll need 2 days to think," she said. "I want to read Gideon's letter properly, and I want to think." "Take the time you need, not because I'm uncertain," she added quickly, "because I respect decisions enough not to rush them." He stood and put his hat back on. He moved to the door and then stopped and turned back. There was something he needed to say and no elegant way to say it, which meant he should just say it. "Gideon told me that the man who hurt you, the one who—" He stopped. Adjusted. "I want you to know that I understand that's a part of this, that you've had reasons not to trust. I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing or that me showing up here removes it." He held his hat. "I just want you to know that I know it's there." Lenora's expression didn't change in any large way, but something in her posture shifted by about 3 degrees, barely perceptible, the kind of shift that could have meant nothing, or could have meant everything, depending on whether you were paying attention. He was paying attention. "2 days, Mr. Crowe," she said. He nodded and went out. The 3 people on the boardwalk across the street watched him walk to his horse. He didn't look at them. He untied the reins, mounted, and rode down the main street of Red Willow at an even pace. And he thought about what it would mean if she said yes, and what it would mean if she said no, and what it would mean that he wasn't sure which answer he was hoping for. He'd given his word to a dying man. But Gideon was gone now, and words outlast the people who ask for them, and the stone in Silas's chest was still there, still heavy, and the woman in that shop had eyes that had seen too much, and a voice that had decided not to be quiet about it. He rode to the boarding house at the edge of town, paid for a room, ate supper without tasting it, and went to bed in the particular way of a man who knew he was not going to sleep lying flat, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind against the window. On the second day, just before noon, a boy from the shop appeared at the boarding house door with a folded note. Silas opened it. "I've made my decision. Come to the shop at 3 o'clock. LV, he read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket, in the same inside pocket where he kept Gideon's letters. He sat with it for a moment, his hand flat against his chest. Whatever she decided, he would honor it. But his heart was doing something he hadn't given it permission to do, something inconvenient and slightly alarming, which was that it was very much hoping she would say yes. He didn't examine that hope too closely. 3 o'clock, and he would know. She said yes, not dramatically, not with tears or hesitation or any of the things Silas had been quietly bracing for during the 2-block walk from the boarding house to the shop. Lenora Vane was standing at her work table when he arrived at 3 o'clock exactly, and she looked up at him the same way she'd looked up the first day steady, measuring, like she was confirming something she'd already decided, and she said, "Yes, but I have conditions, and they're not negotiable." He said, "Let's hear them." She had written them down on a piece of paper. 4 conditions numbered in handwriting that was small and extremely precise. He read them twice. And then he said, "I can live with all of these." And she said, "Good." And that was the closest thing to a romantic exchange that either of them managed on the day they agreed to get married. The wedding was 11 days later. The justice of the peace in Red Willow was a man named Aldous Fitch, who smelled of pipe tobacco and performed the ceremony with the specific boredom of a man who had done this enough times that the words had lost all their individual weight. There were two witnesses, a woman named Pearl, who worked at the dry goods store and who had been quietly kind to Lenora in the way that shy people are kind, doing small things without drawing attention to themselves, and a ranch hand named Dooley, who worked for Edmund Caldwell and had ridden in with Silas and spent the ceremony looking at his boots. Lenora wore a dress she'd made herself, dark green wool, fitted and practical with nothing fussy about it. She'd done something with her hair that involved pins and more effort than she'd ever admit to, and when Silas saw her, he noticed and said nothing, which was the right call, and she noticed that he noticed and said nothing, which was also the right call, and they both stood in front of Aldous Fitch and made promises to each other that neither of them was sure they understood the full weight of yet. When Fitch said Silas could kiss his bride, there was a small pause, half a second, maybe less, where both of them processed the instruction and made private calculations. Then Silas leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek. Not the scarred side. Not the unscarred side either, specifically just wherever was closest, wherever was natural, without making a production of the choice. It was over in a moment. Lenora's expression didn't change. But her shoulders dropped about a quarter inch, which meant something had released that she'd been holding tight. Pearl clapped. Dooley said, "All right then," in a tone that covered several possible meanings. They rode to the ranch house that afternoon. Lenora in the wagon with her 2 trunks and a wooden crate containing her thread and tools and the particular small items of her trade, Silas riding alongside. They didn't talk much on the road. There was wind and the road was rough, and there was something companionable about shared silence that neither of them named because naming it would have made it strange. The ranch house was a long, low building that had been added to 3 separate times by 3 different owners, with different ideas about what a house should look like. And the result was functional in the way of something that had been solved rather than built. There was a good kitchen, which mattered. There were 2 bedrooms separated by a hallway, which had been Lenora's first condition. She looked at the house for a moment when the wagon stopped. Then she picked up her crate and walked inside, and Silas heard her moving through the rooms while he unhitched the horses, and when he came in, she had already found where the coffee was stored and had water heating on the stove, and that was the first indication that the particular geography of their life together was going to be negotiated one small decision at a time. The first 2 weeks were an exercise in learning how to share space without trespassing on each other. Silas was up before 5, which was habitual and non-negotiable, and she adapted to without complaint. Lenora was asleep by 9:30, which surprised him faintly, though he never said so. They ate breakfast together most mornings, not from any formal agreement, just from the logic of 2 people who occupied the same kitchen at the same hour. The conversations were short and practical. Pass the salt. Weather looks to hold. The gray mare's favoring her left foreleg. I'll have the farrier out Thursday. It wasn't comfortable, exactly. It was wary. 2 people who had each spent a long time being careful about what they let themselves need, now obligated to sit across a table from each other every morning and manage the exposure. What Silas noticed first in those early weeks was that Lenora never performed anything. Most people performed something around him deference, because he was the foreman and there was hierarchy to manage, or a kind of aggressive normalcy. Because the scar made people nervous and performing normalcy was how they dealt with their own nervousness. Lenora did neither. She said what she thought. She asked questions when she didn't know something, without the self-consciousness of someone who thought not knowing was shameful. When she disagreed with him, she said so in the same level voice she used when she agreed, which was disorienting in a way he couldn't quite place for the first week. And then he placed it. He had never in his life been disagreed with by someone who wasn't either angry or afraid. She was neither. She was just Lenora, stating her position, and then looking at him to see if he had a counter-argument worth considering. He found himself developing counter-arguments worth considering. He found himself, disturbing as this was to acknowledge, looking forward to having them. The first real friction came 10 days in, over the question of her sewing shop. She had found the old storage building on the eastern edge of the ranch property and decided it would do. She told Silas at breakfast on a Wednesday morning, in the same tone she'd have used to discuss weather. "I'm going to clean out the east building and set up my work there," she said. "I need proper light and space. I can't work out of the bedroom." Silas put down his coffee. "That building needs the roof repaired." "I know, I can work around it for now, Lenora. Half the roof is." "I know what it is. I've already looked at it. I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm telling you my plan." He looked at her. She looked back at him. The conversation held a beat of pure stubbornness from both directions, like two people leaning against opposite sides of the same door. And then Silas made a decision that he would later identify as the first genuinely intelligent thing he did in their marriage, which was to get out of the way. "I'll have the roof looked at by end of week," he said. "You shouldn't have to work around a hole in the ceiling." She didn't thank him effusively. She said, "That would help," and went back to her breakfast. But there was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from the wariness of the previous 10 days. Slightly less defended, a degree or two warmer, he had the roof repaired by Thursday. She had the shop open for customers by the following Monday. Red Willow's reaction to Lenora Vane reopening her trade from the Caldwell Ranch property was complicated in the way that small-town reactions to unexpected things always are part curiosity, part resentment, part the specific discomfort of people who had made assumptions that were being quietly disproved. Old Hartwell from the Mercantile told anyone who would listen that it wouldn't last the month. His wife, who was a better judge of character, told him to stop talking about things he didn't understand, and he didn't listen, which was also habitual. Lenora's first customer in the new shop was a woman named Clara Briggs, the wife of one of Caldwell's senior ranch hands, who needed a coat altered and was too practical to let social politics interfere with a good seamstress being suddenly accessible. Clara came on Tuesday morning and left an hour later with an altered coat and a forthcoming appointment for a dress, and she said to her neighbor on the way home that Lenora Vane was, whatever else anyone wanted to say about her, extremely good at her work. Word traveled the way useful information does steadily, by women talking to other women in the ordinary courses of their days. By the end of the first month, Lenora had more business than she'd had in Red Willow proper. By the end of the second month, she'd taken on 2 young women as part-time help, walking them through the more basic alterations work while she handled the complex commissions herself. Silas watched this happen from a careful distance that had started as respect for her independence and gradually became something else, a genuine interest in how she operated, how she managed people, how she handled the specific kind of difficulty that arose when a woman in 1879 Wyoming tried to run anything without a man visibly attached to it. She handled it with a precision that he found remarkable. When a supplier in Laramie tried to quote her inflated prices banking on the assumption that she wouldn't know what the going rate was, she sent back a letter quoting the going rate from 3 different sources and asking him to revise his figure. He revised it. When one of Caldwell's younger hands made a comment about her face loud enough to carry across the yard, she stopped what she was doing, walked to where he was standing, and said, clearly and without heat, "Say that again, and I'll make sure every woman within 20 miles knows your name and your character. See how that works out for you." The hand didn't say it again. Silas heard about it secondhand from Dooley, who told the story with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided admiration was the appropriate response, but wasn't sure if he was allowed to say so. Silas said good, and meant it in a way that surprised even himself. The ledger discovery happened by accident, the way most important things do. It was a Sunday in April, the 3rd month of their marriage, and Caldwell had ridden over to discuss a supply order and had left a set of ledgers on the kitchen table while he and Silas talked on the porch. Lenora came in from the shop, saw the ledgers, and picked up the top one with the casual habit of a woman who read anything that was in front of her. She was 3 pages in before Caldwell came back inside. He looked at her. She looked at him. The ledger was open in her hands. "Mrs. Crowe," Caldwell said, in a tone that was trying to be pleasant, but was coming from a place of genuine surprise that she was there at all. Which was a common failing of his. He processed the world in sections, and Lenora had not been in his section about the ranch kitchen. "I didn't realize, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Your feed supplier is billing you 18% above the county average. Has been for at least 2 years based on this." Caldwell stared at her. "I beg your pardon, page 4 and then page 11. The freight charges changed in February of 1,877, and the per-unit price changed 3 months later, and neither change corresponds to anything I can find in the market rates from that period." She held out the ledger. "Either he's overcharging you, or someone made a consistent error on entry. Either way, you're losing money you don't have to be losing." Caldwell took the ledger. He looked at page 4 and then page 11, and the silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of a man who has just been told something that his own people should have caught and didn't. "You read ledgers," he said. "It came out as a statement, but it was really a question." "My father kept books for a dry goods operation in Ohio," Lenora said. "I grew up reading them. I've been keeping my own since I was 17. Caldwell looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at Silas, who had come in from the porch and was standing in the doorway with an expression that could most charitably be described as unsurprised. "How bad is it?" Caldwell asked. "Give me an hour with the full set of ledgers, and I'll tell you exactly," Lenora said. She told him exactly. It took 40 minutes. The number was large enough that Caldwell sat down in the kitchen chair and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to hire you to go through the rest of these." And then, as if catching himself, "If your husband doesn't. My husband doesn't make decisions about my work." Lenora said, in the same pleasant, absolutely immovable tone she used for everything, "Yes, Mr. Caldwell, I'll take the commission." Later that evening, after Caldwell had gone, Silas was at the kitchen table reading a contract, and Lenora was across from him with the ledgers spread out in front of her, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Silas said, "You didn't tell me you kept books. You didn't ask. What else haven't I asked about?" She considered this seriously, in the way she considered everything. "Quite a lot, probably. We don't talk much, we talk. About the ranch and the weather and the horses." She looked up from the ledger. "That's not nothing, but it's not much either." He didn't have a good answer for that. He turned a page on his contract and didn't read it. Then he said, "What would you talk about if we talked?" "What do you mean? If you could say anything right now that you've been not saying, what would it be?" She studied him with those eyes that were always running a calculation he couldn't quite see. Then she said, slowly, "I'd say that I don't know what to do with someone who keeps their word. I'm not used to it. It makes me nervous, actually. Because it means I have to decide what I'm going to do with the fact that you're not what I was prepared for." Silas put the contract down entirely. "What were you prepared for?" "Someone who would put up with me because he'd made a promise. Someone who was enduring it." She said it plainly, without self-pity, just as a fact of how she'd built the expectation. "You're not enduring it, and I don't know what to call that instead." Silas thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about anything. "Neither do I," he admitted, "but I don't think it's a problem." She looked at him for a long moment, then she went back to the ledger. But the quality of the silence in the kitchen had changed again, shifted another degree. and Silas thought that if they kept having small conversations like this one, something was eventually going to have to be said that neither of them was ready for yet. He was right about that. He just didn't know how long yet would take. The blizzard came in October, which was early even by Wyoming's unreasonable standards. Silas had ridden out with the cattle crew to move the herd before the weather closed in, and he was 6 miles from the ranch house when the temperature dropped and the sky did the thing that meant you had 2 hours, maybe less. He sent word back with one of the hands, a kid named Roy who could ride faster than anyone on the property, and Roy made it back to the ranch house and delivered the message. Stay inside. Storm's bad, back when it breaks. What Roy didn't know, because he hadn't been told, because Lenora hadn't mentioned it when she'd waved him off that morning, was that 2 children from the Briggs family had been at the shop since morning for a fitting, and the fitting had run long. And by the time anyone realized the weather was turning, the Briggs ranch was 3 miles away, and the road between here and there was disappearing fast. Clara Briggs's 2 youngest, a girl named Willa, who was 8, and a boy named Thomas, who was 6, stood in Lenora's shop doorway and looked at the sky and started to understand what was happening with the clarity that children sometimes have about dangerous things, which is a purer fear than the adult version because it doesn't have denial wrapped around it yet. Willa said, "We can't get home," and Lenora said, "No." "But you don't have to." She got them inside the ranch house. She fed them from what she had in the kitchen. She found blankets and made up a pallet near the stove because the bedrooms would get cold and the main room wouldn't. And she sat with them through the early part of the storm, reading aloud from a book she found on the shelf, one of Silas's, a battered account of frontier geography that was not, in any conventional sense, a children's book, but she read it with enough animation and invented voices that Willa and Thomas were entertained despite themselves. By midnight, the storm was at full force and both children were asleep on the pallet, and Lenora was sitting in the chair by the stove with a blanket over her knees, listening to the wind do violence outside. She was not scared of storms, precisely. She was scared of what was out in them. She kept coming back to that thought with a regularity that alarmed her, because the thing out in the storm that she was scared for was Silas, and she hadn't given herself permission to be scared for Silas yet. Hadn't crossed whatever threshold separated polite concern for a person who shared your house from genuine fear for a person you'd made the mistake of starting to care about. She sat with it for 3 hours. By the time it was clear she wasn't going to sleep, she had made peace with it, the way you make peace with something you can't change, not by being comfortable with it, but by accepting that the discomfort is accurate information about where you are. She cared about him. That was the information. She didn't know what to do with it yet. Silas came back 18 hours after the storm broke, which was 18 hours after Lenora had started counting. He came through the door of the ranch house, looking like something the weather had used for practice coated in ice that was melting at the edges, moving carefully in the way of a man who had stopped feeling his feet somewhere around hour 4 and was now navigating by memory. Lenora was in the kitchen. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the ledger page with the inflated feed prices, with a searching attention, checking the numbers, making sure the account balanced. He was standing. He was moving under his own power. The ice in his beard was melting onto her clean floor. "Children," he said, because Roy had gotten a second message out before the worst of it hit. "Asleep. Fine. I've already sent word to the Briggs Ranch this morning." She moved to the stove, where water was already hot, and poured it. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine. You're gray, Silas." He looked down at his hands as if checking them for color, and then he sat at the kitchen table because his body had simply made the decision for him while he was busy disagreeing. Lenora put a cup of coffee in front of him and then stood there for a moment with her hand still near it, not quite withdrawn. And then she did something that she did not plan and could not have predicted, which was that she put her hand over his cold, ice-stiff, barely responsive hand and held it for 3 seconds. Then she removed her hand and went back to the stove. Silas looked at his hand. Then he looked at the back of her head. He drank the coffee. He would think about those 3 seconds for the next week, turning them over carefully, the way he turned over problems. He didn't know how to solve, yet examining them from different angles, checking for what he might have missed. He wasn't a man who reached conclusions quickly about things that mattered. He was a man who needed to be sure. But he was moving, steadily and without quite intending to, toward a conclusion he hadn't planned for. And the moving frightened him in exactly the way he'd been afraid it would when Gideon asked him to come here, the specific fear of a man who has lived safely for a long time and can feel the walls of that safety beginning to shift. That evening, the children were collected by a grateful and slightly tearful Clara Briggs, and the ranch house was quiet again, and Silas came and sat in front of the fire while Lenora put away the extra blankets. She came and sat in the other chair, not with any particular ceremony, just because the fire was warm and the storm had taken something out of both of them. They were quiet for a while. Outside, the aftermath of the blizzard was settling the specific silence of a world muffled under new snow, where even the horses seemed to be moving more carefully, as if the ground itself had become temporary. Then Silas said, "What were you afraid of last night?" When the storm was on, she was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted in the grate, that it would take too long to break, she said. Which was true, and also the least true version of true she could have offered. And some part of him knew it, and some part of her knew that he knew it, and neither of them pushed on it further. Not that night, but the question had been asked, and questions like that don't disappear. They settle, like snow, quietly into the ground, and you don't know what's growing from them until something breaks the surface. It was November when Silas found her crying. He hadn't meant to. He'd come in through the back door of the shop to tell her the Laramie fabric order had arrived, and the door was slightly ajar because the latch had been sticking for a week, and neither of them had dealt with it yet. He pushed it open and stopped. She was sitting at her work table with a letter in her hands, and she was crying in the particular way of someone who doesn't cry in front of people quietly, with the controlled breathing of a person who has learned to do this without being seen, tears moving down her face without any sound to accompany them. He saw the letter. He recognized the handwriting. It was Gideon's, one of the letters she'd kept in the wooden box on her shelf, the one she sometimes took out and he sometimes noticed and never mentioned. She heard him at the door. She didn't startle exactly, but her back straightened and her breathing did something precise and careful, and by the time she turned to look at him, her face was substantially composed. The tears were still there. There was nothing to be done about the tears, but the rest of her had rearranged itself. "The latch is still broken," she said. "I know, I'm sorry. He didn't leave." He also didn't come further in. He just stood there in the doorway with the good sense not to say something useless like, "Are you all right?" when she was obviously not all right, and both of them knew it. "It would have been his birthday," she said. "This week. Gideon's." "I know." She looked at him. "Were you going to observe it?" "I didn't think to ask." "I was going to ride out to the cemetery and be bad company for an hour," he said. "That's about my limit for observation." Something in her face softened just slightly, the way it did sometimes when he said something she hadn't expected. Not a smile, not quite, but the thing that came before it. "That sounds right," she said. "He wouldn't have wanted ceremony." "He would have wanted whiskey and a bad poker hand," Silas said. Those were the two things he enjoyed most. She laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised her, judging by the expression that followed it. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, practical and without theater. "I never met him," she said. "I only knew his letters." And yet she stopped. "I missed the version of him I was going to know." "Is that strange?" "No," Silas said. "It's honest." She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. Then she looked at Silas in the doorway, and he looked at her at the table. And they were both people who had lost different things, layered differently. shaped differently by the losing and the recognition of that was passed between them, without either one of them finding words for it. He came into the shop fully and sat down in the customer chair across from her. "He saved my life once," Silas said. "I've never told you that." She was listening in the way she listened when she wanted all of it, no interruptions, no filling of silences, just receiving what was being offered. Told her, the river crossing the current, the moment where the math stopped adding up in his favor, and Gideon had gone in anyway. He told it plainly, without embellishment, the way he told everything, just the facts, just what happened, with the emotion carried in the facts themselves rather than in anything layered over them. When he finished, she said, "That's why you came here." "That's part of it. What's the other part?" He thought about it for a moment. Really thought about it, in the careful way that meant he was going to tell her the truth rather than the version of truth that was easier to live with. "He told me who you were," Silas said, "what you'd survived. What you'd built anyway, and he was dying and I couldn't change that, and doing nothing felt..." He stopped. Found it Gideon always acted. That was who he was. He didn't calculate, he just moved toward what needed doing. Coming here was the most like him I could be. I don't know if that makes sense. Quiet in the shop. Outside, the November wind moved through the eaves. "It makes sense," Lenora said, quietly, carefully, like she was handling something that could break if treated wrong. It was also still a very strange thing to do. "Yes," he agreed. It was. She picked up the letter again and then set it down. Then she said something she had been not saying since October, since the night of the blizzard, since the kitchen and the coffee and the 3 seconds she still thought about more than she was comfortable with. "I'm glad you came, Silas, whatever this is or isn't." "I'm glad," he looked at her across the work table. The light in the shop in November, at that hour, came through the window at a particular angle, and it caught the planes of her face both sides. The scarred side and the unscarred side with an even-handedness that the rest of the world mostly hadn't managed. He had stopped noticing the scar the way you stop noticing the sound of a river when you've lived near it long enough. It was just part of the landscape of her, which was a landscape he had been mapping, without consciously meaning to, for 8 months. "I'm glad too," he said. He got up and fixed the broken latch before he left. She heard him working at it from inside, the small, purposeful sounds of a man with a tool doing a thing that needed doing. And she sat at her work table with her hands folded on top of Gideon's letter, and she thought that whatever she had agreed to in that shop in February, it was not this. And whatever this was, she did not have a word for it yet. And she was not sure she was afraid of it anymore. The word glad sat between them for a week, like something neither one of them wanted to disturb by looking at it too directly. Silas noticed it most at breakfast, which had become the hour of the day that told him the most about where things stood. In the early months, breakfast had been a transaction, 2 people exchanging necessary information over coffee, and then separating to their respective work. Now it was something harder to name. Lenora brought a book to the table sometimes, which he'd initially taken as a signal that she wanted quiet, until the 3rd time she read something aloud to him, unprompted, a passage about crop rotation in the Ohio Valley that she'd found relevant to something they'd argued about the week before, and he understood that the book was not a wall. It was her way of sharing things she found interesting without making a ceremony of the sharing. He started doing the same. He was not a reader the way she was, but he had opinions about cattle management that he'd spent years keeping largely to himself because the ranch hands didn't want a lecture, and Caldwell didn't want to be wrong, and Lenora was neither. She pushed back. She brought her own information to bear. She made him rethink things he'd been doing on habit for 15 years, which was uncomfortable in the way that useful things often are. December arrived the way December arrives in Wyoming, not gradually, but all at once, like a door swung open onto cold. The shop was busy in the run-up to the holiday season, women wanting dresses altered or new things made, and Lenora managed the work and the 2 assistants and the supply orders with an efficiency that Silas watched from a distance and admired in the private, unarticulated way he admired most things. She was not a person who moved slowly when there was something to be done, and watching her work was not unlike watching a good horse move everything purposeful, nothing wasted. It was in this season that Silas made a decision that he could not entirely explain, even to himself, and which changed the direction of everything that followed. He had been thinking about the ranch. More specifically, he had been thinking about the vulnerability of a cattle operation, the weather dependency, the price volatility, the way a bad winter or a collapsed market could take a profitable year and turn it into a debt in the space of 6 weeks. He had watched this happen to other operations. He had watched Caldwell's margins narrow year by year as the equation got more complicated and the variables got less forgiving. And then one evening in early December, he was walking the western pasture at dusk a habit, checking fences, checking the ground, and he stopped at a section of low, sheltered acreage that had good drainage and southern exposure and had been sitting unused for 2 seasons because nobody had thought of a better use for it. He stood there for a while in the cold thinking. He came home and put a question to Lenora across the dinner table. "Do you know anything about flax?" She looked up from her plate. Growing it or working it both, she set down her fork. This was a tell he'd learned. She set things down when something had her full attention. "My grandfather grew it in Pennsylvania. Linens made from it. You wet the stalks, you break them, you comb out the fiber and spin it." She looked at him carefully. "Why are you asking me about flax, Silas?" He told her about the western pasture. He told her what he'd been thinking, a second crop, a second income stream, something that wasn't subject to the same disasters that could take the cattle operation down. Something that worked with what the land already offered, rather than fighting what it didn't. She listened without interrupting, which meant she was taking it seriously. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment, and he could see her working through it the same expression she had over ledger pages, the quick, precise calculation running behind her eyes. "If you grow it, you need to process it," she said. "I know. Processing requires equipment, space, labor." "I know that, too. And if you're going to sell it, you need a buyer who wants linen fiber, not someone who will pay you grain prices because they don't know what they're looking at." "I've been thinking about Denver," he said. "There are textile merchants there." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said slowly, like she was feeling the shape of it as she spoke, "If we controlled the cultivation and the processing both, if we weren't just growing it and handing it off, we could set the price rather than accept it. Yes, and if we processed it here, we'd need people to do that processing. Women, most likely, for the fiber work. Women who'd need wages." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him. Not in the ledger calculation way now, but in a different way, the way she looked when something had landed that she hadn't expected, that had gotten past the careful management she applied to most incoming information. "You thought of the women," she said. "You've been teaching women in that shop for 8 months, he said. "I wasn't not going to think of it." She was quiet for so long that he picked up his fork again, assuming the conversation was pausing while she processed. Then she said, "We'd need Caldwell to agree, and he's going to say it's a risk." "It is a risk. He's going to want numbers. Then we bring him numbers." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight of the kitchen that they had, over the course of 10 months, made into a place that felt against all original expectation like somewhere they both actually lived. "You said she said. "Whose idea do you think it would be walking into that meeting?" he said. "Mine or yours?" Something crossed her face that was too quick to catch entirely, but the quality of it stayed in the air between them for the rest of the evening. They sat up late at the kitchen table with paper and Lenora's ledger skills and Silas's land knowledge, and they built the outline of a proposal. And when they finally stopped at nearly midnight, the table was covered with figures and the fire was low, and Lenora's hair had partially escaped its pins from the hours of bent-over work. And she didn't notice, and he did, and he said nothing, because some things were better left in the natural condition they reached without comment. Caldwell said it was a risk, exactly as predicted. He sat at the head of his dining table. They'd presented it formally. Silas had insisted on that and looked at the figures Lenora had prepared and said, "This could fail spectacularly." "You know that." "Yes," Silas said. "I could lose 5 acres of productive pasture to an experiment that doesn't pan out." "You could," Lenora said. "Or you could gain a second income stream that isn't subject to the same climate and market pressures that have been narrowing your margins for 3 years. She tapped the relevant page in the figures. "That number represents what you lost in the winter of 1,877 alone. 5 acres of flax at production, if the Denver contacts come through, would cover that loss in the first good season." Caldwell looked at Silas. "Your wife put these numbers together." "My wife put these numbers together," Silas confirmed, in a tone that made clear this was an answer and not a caveat. Caldwell looked back at the figures. He was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, a man who had survived in the cattle business for 20 years by being careful, which meant he could recognize when caution was the wrong response to a well-built argument. He just didn't enjoy recognizing it. 5 acres, he said finally. "We try 5 acres. If it comes to nothing, we don't discuss this again." "Agreed," Silas said. Lenora said nothing. She was already visibly thinking about planting schedules. They shook hands and rode home in the winter cold, and somewhere around the halfway point on the road back to the ranch house, Silas said, "You knew he'd say yes." "I knew the numbers would say yes," Lenora said. "I had less certainty about Caldwell. He's not as stubborn as he looks. Most people aren't as stubborn as they look. They're just afraid of the thing that comes after they stop being stubborn." He looked at her, riding beside him with her back straight against the cold and her breath coming in small, visible puffs in the December air. "What are you afraid of?" he asked, "right now, about the flax." She thought about it. "That it won't grow," she said. "That I'll stand in that field and see nothing, and have to come back and tell you I was wrong. And if it doesn't grow, is that the end of it?" "No," she said without hesitation. "Then we adjust the approach and try again. But the first failure still hurts, even when it's not the last one." He nodded. He knew something about that. He knew a lot about that, actually. They rode the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence that their silences had become not empty, not avoidant, but the shared quiet of 2 people who had run out of necessary words and were not uncomfortable with what was left. They planted in March in ground that had been prepared through February, with more labor than Silas had anticipated and less complaint than he'd expected from the hands who'd been signed to help. The seed came from a supplier in Cheyenne that Lenora had located through 3 letters and 1 firm negotiation over price. The planting itself was done on a cold, bright Thursday, the kind of day that Wyoming offers in March like a promise it might not keep the sun clear and high, the ground hard at the edges but workable in the middle rows. Silas did the first rows himself. He wasn't sure why, except that it felt like the beginning of something, and beginnings deserved to be marked by the people they mattered most to. Lenora stood at the edge of the field, with her arms crossed against the cold, watching, and when he came back past her on the 3rd row, she fell in beside him without discussion, and they worked the rest of the morning together. That afternoon, back at the ranch house with mud on their boots and no immediate other occupation, Silas sat at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me something about yourself I don't know yet." Lenora looked up from the basin where she was washing her hands. "That's an unusual thing to say. We've been married 11 months, he said. "I find I want to know more than I do." She dried her hands. She sat down across from him. She looked at him with the measuring expression. The one he now knew meant she was deciding not how much to say, but in what order to say it, because Lenora did not withhold things out of secrecy, but out of structure, wanting to place things correctly. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said before, "when I was young, and that still felt like a thing I might do." "Why didn't you?" "Because what happened to my face also happened to my chance at that. The school in our town didn't want someone whose face unsettled the children, or so the board put it. She said it without bitterness, which was the most damning way to say a thing like that when the wound is old enough that the anger has burned down to something colder and more permanent. So I learned to sew, which my mother said was a blessing. And my mother was wrong, but the sewing was right. "You're teaching now," Silas said. "In the shop." Yes, she considered it. "It's not what I imagined when I was 16, but it might be better than what I imagined, actually. I get to teach women who need it to matter. At 16, I'd have been teaching children whose lives were already going to be fine." He held that for a moment. "What was the man's name?" he said. The one who he stopped. He had never asked this directly. He'd always left it where she'd left it, unspecified, giving her control over what was said. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the kitchen stove moved and light shifted across the wall. "Nathan Greer," she said. "He worked for my father." He thought my refusal was an opinion he could change. She said it flat and clean, the way you talk about old damage when you've made your peace with the fact of it, even if you haven't made peace with the thing itself. He was wrong. He was also very fast, and I was very alone, and the knife was his. She looked at the table. He left the county before anyone could do anything about it. Or that's what I was told. I chose eventually to believe it because the alternative that nobody tried was harder to carry. Silas said nothing for a moment. He was not a man who filled silence with reassurance because he understood that reassurance was mostly for the reassurer. What he said, when he spoke, was, "That's 9 years of carrying something that wasn't yours to carry. Yes, I'm sorry you had to. You didn't do it. I know. I'm sorry anyway." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, without the inflation that made apologies about the speaker instead of the person receiving them. Just the plain fact of the regret. She looked at him across the table. The measuring expression had changed into something else, something less guarded, and he was aware of how rarely he saw her face without at least some degree of guard in it, because she'd needed the guard, had needed it for years, and it had saved her. But it was not there right now, and the absence of it was a thing that required his full attention. "He was wrong," Silas said, "about what he thought he was taking from you. You're still here. You built all of this." He gestured, meaning the shop, the ledgers, the 5 acres outside, the life she had constructed from pieces that should not have been enough. Scar means you survived it. It doesn't mean anything else. Lenora was quiet for long enough that he thought he'd said too much, or the wrong thing, or that the conversation had reached its natural end and he'd pushed past it. But then she said very quietly, "Nobody has ever said that to me before." In 9 years. Then they weren't paying attention, he said. She stood up and moved to the stove, and stood there with her back to him for a moment, doing something with the kettle that probably didn't require as much attention as she was giving it. When she turned around, her eyes were dry and her expression was collected. But the quality of the collecting was different, not the armor kind, not the self-protection kind, but the kind that comes when something has moved inside you and you're making room for it to settle. "Thank you," she said, quiet, specific, like she was handing him something valuable and wanted him to know she knew its worth. He nodded. He understood that this was not the moment for anything else. Passed. May arrived. The 5 acres of flax sat in the western field and did nothing visible, and then continued to do nothing visible for a second week, and then a third. And the silence of the ground began to take on a quality that Silas recognized as the particular patience test of farming, the long wait between action and result, during which there was nothing to do but maintain the conditions and resist the urge to dig up what you'd planted to check if it was working. He resisted it better than he expected to. Lenora resisted it with the disciplined focus of a person who had learned that looking at a thing too hard didn't make it happen faster. She channeled the waiting into the shop work, into the ledger work for Caldwell, into corresponding with the Denver textile contact, a merchant named August Farwell, who had responded to her first letter with professional interest, and her second with professional excitement, and her third with an invitation to continue. The conversation, once she had something to show him. The ranch hands had opinions about the flax, delivered in the indirect way of men who don't want to commit to an opinion they might later have to walk back. Dooley said it was an interesting idea in the tone of a man who thought it was not an interesting idea. Roy, who was young enough to still find most things genuinely interesting, asked Lenora detailed questions about the fiber processing that she answered in detail, which surprised him and earned her a loyalty that she hadn't asked for but didn't dismiss. On the 17th day after planting, Lenora was walking the perimeter of the field in the early morning, a habit she'd developed. She would not have called it checking. She would have called it the same word she used for everything she did that was actually checking when she stopped. She crouched down on the edge of the row, tiny green, almost nothing, but there, she stayed crouched for a long time. She put one finger, very carefully, next to not touching the nearest shoot, as if proximity counted for something. Then she stood up and walked back to the ranch house at a pace that was not running, was absolutely not running, and went in through the kitchen door. Silas was at the table with his second coffee and a fence repair list. He looked up. She said, "Come look at the field." The way she said it told him everything before he stood up. He put on his coat and followed her out, and she walked him to the edge of the 5th row and pointed, and he crouched the same way she had and looked at what was barely there and would soon be something. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at her. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen before open, in a way that she almost never was, all the careful management temporarily suspended. Just Lenora, looking at him with something close to joy and close to fear, mixed in a proportion that he understood perfectly, because he felt the same thing. "Growing," she said, unnecessarily. "Perfectly." "It's growing," he agreed. She laughed that short, genuine laugh that still surprised her when it came out. And then she did something that surprised them both, which was that she grabbed his arm, just above the elbow, and held it for a moment with the grip of someone who needed to hold on to something real. He didn't move. He let her hold it. He thought that this was one of those moments that you either ruin by doing too much or honor by doing nothing, and he had spent enough of his life doing too much in the wrong directions. He did nothing. He stood in the early morning light next to the beginning of 5 acres of something that mattered, and Lenora Vane, Lenora Crowe, he thought, though he still wasn't sure what that name meant to either of them, held his arm, and the field stretched out in front of them, small and impossible and real. Summer came, and the flax grew with an urgency that made up for every day of the wait. By June, the field had transformed in the way that growing things transform, not gradually but in sudden visible leaps, as if the plants were making decisions. By July, it was extraordinary. The blue flowers opened in a wave across the 5 acres, and the color of them was something Silas had no word for, not quite blue, not quite purple. Closer to the color of sky at that specific hour before evening, when the light changes its character. Lenora stood at the edge of the field one July morning and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "My grandfather said it was the most beautiful crop he ever grew." "I thought he was being sentimental." "He wasn't," Silas said. No, she smiled, a real one, unguarded, the kind that went all the way to her eyes and didn't stop to check whether it should. He wasn't. The work of the summer was exhausting in the way of anything worth doing, the tending, the watering, through a dry August stretch that made Silas spend 3 nights watching the sky and calculating. The correspondence with Farwell in Denver that Lenora managed with the precision of someone negotiating the terms of a treaty. Farwell wanted to see the harvested fiber before he committed to a price. She told him the fiber would meet his standards. He said he'd be the judge of that. She said she was certain he would be, and that she looked forward to proving him right, and something in the tone of that letter made Silas, when she read it aloud to him at dinner, put down his fork and look at her with undisguised admiration. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You have an expression." "I don't have expressions. You have at least 3. That one is the admiration one." He picked up his fork. "You're negotiating with a Denver merchant, like you've been doing it for 20 years. I've been managing men who didn't think I deserved to be in the room since I was 22, she said. Farwell is just the most recent version. She was right about that. She was right about most things, which he had stopped finding as disorienting as he once had, and started finding he could admit this, at least to himself, something close to a relief. He had spent 30 years making decisions alone, and the solitude of that had been manageable but not good. And having someone whose judgment he trusted sitting across from him at the table every night was something he had not known he was missing because he had never had it to miss before. It was during the August harvest that Caldwell finally said, in his particular style of compliment that worked by declining to be one, I was wrong to be skeptical. Silas was standing beside him at the edge of the field, watching 3 hired women from town work the cut stalks. You weren't wrong, Silas said. It was a real risk. The risk was mine, Caldwell said. The judgment was hers. He looked at Silas sideways. You knew that when you brought me the proposal, I knew the numbers were right. You knew who made the numbers was right, Caldwell said, in the tone of a man correcting a point of emphasis rather than a fact. He was quiet for a moment. She's something, Silas. I'll say that plain. That woman is something. Yes, Silas said. Simply, fully. He looked at the field and at Lenora, who was 20 feet away with her sleeves rolled up, talking to one of the hired women about the redding process, showing her the technique with her hands. The same way she showed everything by doing it herself first, making the learning visible rather than just the instruction. That evening they rode back to the ranch house side by side, and the sky was doing something complicated with orange and red above the ridge, and the air was cooling fast the way it did in August in Wyoming. And Silas said, without planning to, without any particular architecture to the decision, I think I've been falling in love with you since about March. Lenora's horse didn't startle. Neither did she. She rode for a moment without responding, and he thought he'd made a mistake, not in the feeling, but in the telling, in the timing, in the calculation of what she was ready to receive. Then she said, I think I've been falling in love with you since the night of the October blizzard. When I put my hand on yours in the kitchen, he looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the road, but the corner of her mouth had done something precise and private. That was 8 months ago, he said. Yes, you've known for 8 months. I suspected for 8 months, she said. I decided to know about 10 minutes ago when you finally said it so I didn't have to. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, That's very strategic of you. Yes, she agreed, unapologetically. He laughed. It came out rougher than he intended. Les contained a real laugh, the kind he didn't have often, that's somewhere below the careful management and came out before he could make it smaller. 2. The short, genuine sound of hers, and the horses kept moving down the road toward home, and the sky kept doing its complicated thing above the ridge. And Silas Crowe thought that he had spent 40 years building a life around not needing anyone. He thought about how spectacularly wrong that project had turned out to be. He thought that he was, for the first time in longer than he could account for, completely glad about something he had not planned. He reached out across the space between their horses, an awkward reach, too far, his hand not quite making it to hers, and she saw the attempt and moved her horse a half step closer so that their hands could meet properly, both of them managing the gap from their respective sides, and that seemed exactly right for the two of them, that neither one would simply wait for the other to do all the moving. They rode into the ranch yard in the last light, and the 5-acre field was behind them, and Farwell's letter was on the kitchen table, waiting to be answered. And whatever came next was going to be hard in the ways that things worth doing are always hard. Field was real. The flowers had been real. And this, whatever shape it was taking between them in the last light of an August evening, was the most real thing Silas had touched in 30 years of careful living. Farwell arrived in September. He came by train to Cheyenne and then by hired coach to Red Willow, which told Silas something about the seriousness of his interest. Men who were merely curious did not hire coaches across 40 miles of Wyoming road. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his 50s, with the particular alertness of someone who had spent a career evaluating things quickly and profitably. And when he stepped down from the coach in front of the Caldwell Ranch, he looked at the property the way he looked at everything, as a set of facts to be assessed, rather than a scene to be appreciated. Lenora met him at the gate. Silas watched this from 20 feet back, where he'd positioned himself deliberately. It was her negotiation. He was there as the ranch's representative and as her husband, and the order of those two things mattered less to him than that she had the room to lead it, without his presence, suggesting she needed to be led. Farwell looked at her with the specific expression of a man recalibrating. His correspondence had been with a Mrs. Crowe, and he had formed some picture of what that meant, and the woman standing in front of him was revising it in real time. He recovered quickly, which was professional, and extended his hand. Mrs. Crowe, August Farwell, Mr. Farwell. She shook his hand the way she shook everything firmly, without performance. How was the road from Cheyenne? Educational, he said, which was the word people used when the answer was terrible and they were trying to stay in a good mood. I appreciate you accommodating the visit on short notice. We're ready for it, she said. Come and see. She walked him to the processing area first, which was the right move, not the field, not the numbers, but the work itself, the tangible evidence of what they'd built. Caldwell had given them the use of a large storage building, and over the summer it had been transformed into a working space, the redding equipment, the breaking and scutching tools, the hackling combs, all arranged in a logical sequence that showed the fiber's journey from raw stalk to clean, prepared material. 3 women were working when Farwell came through Clara Briggs's sister-in-law, a woman named May, and 2 others from town whom Lenora had trained through the summer, and they kept working while the visitor watched, which was also the right call. Nothing performed, just the actual operation doing what it did. Farwell picked up a prepared bundle of fiber and worked it between his fingers with the attention of someone who knew exactly what he was feeling for. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, without looking up, "This is cleaner than I expected." "We adjusted the redding time twice before we got the result we wanted," Lenora said. "The first batch was too brittle. The second was better. This is the third method. You documented the process?" "I documented everything." She held up the notebook she'd been carrying since the morning, which Silas knew contained detailed notes on every stage of the operation going back to the first planting. Temperature, duration, fiber quality assessments at each stage. If you scale this up, you need to know what worked and what didn't and why. Farwell looked at the notebook, then at her. "May I?" She handed it to him. He read for 4 minutes. Silas counted because he was paying attention to everything, and 4 minutes of silence from a man like Farwell was significant. Then Farwell handed the notebook back and said, "Show me the field." The field in September was past its flowering, the blue was gone, replaced by the taller, paler stalks of the harvest-ready crop, which had its own kind of beauty but a practical one, less romantic and more serious. Farwell walked the rows with Lenora while Silas followed at the same careful distance. She showed him the soil, explained the drainage situation, described the winter preparation that would be needed if they expanded acreage. He asked questions that were specific and technical, and she answered them without hesitation. And Silas observed that Farwell's posture was changing as the conversation progressed, the initial assessment stance slowly replaced by something more like engagement. The stance of a man who has come expecting to be moderately interested and is becoming genuinely interested instead. At the far end of the field, Farwell stopped and turned to look back at the whole of it. 5 acres. Not large by any objective measure, but tended with a precision that showed in the evenness of the rows, the condition of the stalks, the absence of the weed pressure that killed margins in poorly managed crops. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and said, "What are you asking per hundredweight?" Lenora named a figure. Farwell was quiet for 3 seconds. "That's above current market. Current market is for fiber that hasn't been processed to this standard. Lenora said. Your buyers in the East are paying a premium for consistency. We can give you consistency because we control every stage. You're not buying a raw commodity. You're buying a managed product with documented process. And if I can find comparable product at market price, you haven't, she said, which is why you hired a coach from Cheyenne. Silas pressed his lips together to keep his expression level. Farwell looked at her for a moment, and then he did something Silas hadn't expected, which was that he smiled, not the professional approximation of a smile, but a real one. The kind that comes when a person has been caught being impressed against their will. Mrs. Crowe, he said, I've been in the textile business for 26 years. I have dealt with suppliers from here to the eastern seaboard. He paused. Your price is high. I'll accept it contingent on the first full delivery meeting the standard in that notebook. If it does, I'd like to discuss a multi-year arrangement. Lenora held his gaze steadily. The delivery will meet the standard. Then we have something to talk about. She extended her hand again. He shook it. And Silas, standing 20 feet back in a harvested flax field in September with Wyoming sky overhead and everything on the line, allowed himself one precise, private exhale of relief. The delivery preparation consumed October entirely. Processing the harvest to Farwell's standard was harder than Silas had anticipated and harder than Lenora let on, which he knew because he knew how to read her now, the specific quality of her silence at dinner when something was troubling her, the way she moved through the processing building on her inspection rounds with a slightly different energy when the numbers weren't adding up the way she wanted. The second batch of the season's redding had come out with inconsistencies that shouldn't have been there, given the documented process. And it took 4 days, and a complete review of the notebooks before Lenora identified the problem, a temperature variation in the redding water during an overnight cold snap that nobody had accounted for, because nobody had thought to account for it, because that was the nature of doing something for the first time. You couldn't anticipate what you didn't yet know to anticipate. She adjusted. She reprocessed the affected batch using a modified approach that she'd developed and tested over 2 days of methodical work, and when she finally had fiber that met the documented standard, she brought a sample to Silas in the kitchen and set it on the table between them and said, "Tell me honestly what you think." He picked it up and worked it between his fingers. He was not a textile expert by any measure, but he'd handled enough of her work over the past year to have developed a sense of what good fiber felt like versus not. This was good. He could feel the difference. "It's right," he said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She sat down across from him. She looked tired in the way of someone who has been running at high capacity for 6 weeks and is starting to feel the edges of it. There were ink stains on her right hand that she hadn't fully washed off, and her hair was doing something at the back that suggested the pins had been losing the argument since mid-morning. "I keep thinking about what happens if Farwell opens the crates in Denver and finds something wrong that I didn't catch," she said. "Then you fix it," Silas said. "Same as the reprocessing." "That's easy to say." "Yes," he agreed. "Most true things are easy to say and hard to sit with." She looked at him. He could see her deciding whether to push back on that or accept it, which was a familiar negotiation in their conversations. She had strong opinions about when comfort was a substitute for honesty, and she didn't accept substitutes. "I'm scared," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I'm not being modest. I'm actually scared." "Good," he said. That surprised her. "Good? You've been scared before." October blizzard, March planting. Every time you brought something to Caldwell that he might have said no to. You've been scared every time it mattered, and you did the work anyway. Your scared is better than most people's confident. He held up the fiber sample. "This is right, Lenora. I'm telling you it's right." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and took the sample from his hand and held it herself, examining it in the lamplight with the close attention she gave to everything she'd made, looking for what wasn't good enough. It took her a long time. He waited. Finally, she set it down. "All right," she said. "We ship Friday." They shipped Friday. The 2 weeks of waiting for Farwell's assessment were the longest 2 weeks of Silas's adult life, which was saying something given that he had spent his adult life in an occupation that included being caught in blizzards, negotiating with difficult cattle buyers, and one memorable autumn managing a fence dispute with a neighboring rancher that had taken on qualities of a small siege. Lenora managed the waiting by working. This was not surprising, it was consistent with everything he knew of her, but the nature of the work shifted. She spent more time with her assistants in the processing building, going back through the documented process with fresh eyes, looking for what could be improved in the next season if there was a next season. She began corresponding with 2 other women in the county who had expressed interest in the operation and who she thought might be worth bringing on if the expansion came. She planned for the contingency of success with the same methodical attention she'd given to managing the possibility of failure. Silas found this the most clarifying thing about her, that she didn't choose between hope and preparation, but ran them in parallel, as if the two were not in tension but complementary. He had spent most of his life planning for failure because planning for success felt like tempting something. She planned for both because the alternative was leaving your future to chance, and she had too much experience with what chance did to women who had nothing but chance to stand on. He said this to her, or something close to it, one evening in late October when the waiting had sharpened to a particular edge. "You plan for things that haven't happened yet," he said. "Good things. You keep lists of what you'd do if it works." "Yes," she said, looking up from the correspondence she was writing. "I've never done that. I plan for what goes wrong." "I know," she said, in the tone of someone who has noticed this for a while and has been waiting for the right moment to say something about it. "You're very good at preventing disaster. You're less practiced at building towards something good." "Is that a criticism?" "It's an observation," she said. With some concern in it, he sat with that. "I didn't have much practice at it," he said. "At expecting things to go right." "I know," she said it gently, which was not her most common register, and the gentleness of it landed differently because of its rarity. "You were alone for a long time, Silas. Alone people learn to manage loss. They don't always learn to receive things." He thought about that for a long time. He thought about it in the way he'd been learning to think about the things she said, not defensively, not with the reflex to find the counter-argument, but with the genuine willingness to test it against his own understanding of himself and see if it fit. It fit. He didn't enjoy that it fit, but it fit. "What would you build?" he said. "If Farwell says yes, if we have the money, if we have the space. What is the full version of what you're imagining?" She put down her pen. She turned to face him fully, which meant she was going to say something she'd been holding for a while. "I want to convert the North Barn," she said. "Full processing facility. Double the acreage next season. Hire 8 women, maybe 10, with real wages, not task wages, regular wages. I want to train them the way I train the women in the shop, so that the knowledge belongs to them and they can take it somewhere else if they need to." She paused. "Because some of them will need to. Some of them are in situations where having money of their own and skills of their own is the difference between staying somewhere they shouldn't stay and being able to go." He looked at her. "You're thinking of specific people." "I'm always thinking of specific people," she said. "Easier to plan for an abstraction. It's more honest to plan for the actual women." He thought about one of her assistants, a quiet young woman named Ruth, who had come to the shop 3 months earlier with a bruise on her forearm that she'd covered with her sleeve and a careful way of moving that Silas had learned to recognize as the economy of someone who'd been hurt and learned to take up less space. He'd seen Lenora notice it too on that first day and say nothing about it while making everything available. "Ruth," he said. "Among others," Lenora said, "but yes." He nodded. He didn't ask more about it because some things didn't need to be unpacked to be understood. He reached across and covered her hand with his, the same gesture she'd made in the kitchen in October of the previous year, which they had never directly discussed, but which they both carried, and he said, "Then that's what we build." She turned her hand over under his so that their palms were together. "You have to stop planning for it to go wrong first," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "Give me time." "You have time," she said. "We have time." Farwell's letter arrived on a Thursday morning in the first week of November, 11 days after his team in Denver had received the shipment. Silas was in the yard when the mail rider came through, and the rider handed him a bundle that included 3 pieces of correspondence and 1 envelope with a Denver return address and the name A. Farwell and Company Textile Merchants printed across the upper corner. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went inside. Lenora was at the kitchen table with the ledgers. She looked up. He held out the envelope. She looked at it. She did not reach for it immediately. "Open it," he said. "You open it," she said, which was so unlike her that it told him everything about what this moment cost her. He sat down across from her and opened it. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he put it flat on the table between them and turned it so she could read it. She read it. The letter said that the delivery had exceeded the standards specified in the agreed documentation. It said that Farwell had shown the sample fiber to 2 of his primary buyers in the East, both of whom had expressed strong interest. It said that Farwell was prepared to offer a multi-year contract at the agreed price for a minimum of 3 times the current volume, contingent on Lenora's ability to maintain documented process consistency at scale. It said, and this was the line that Silas watched her read twice, that in 26 years of working with frontier suppliers, Farwell had rarely encountered operational documentation of this quality from an established producer, let alone a first-year operation. Lenora read the letter. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and put both hands flat beside it and looked at the wall for a moment. And Silas watched the calculation run, not the business calculation. She'd done that months ago. But the other one, the one that was running the math on what it meant that this had actually worked, that the fear and the planting and the reprocessing and the waiting had all been in service of something real. 3 times the volume, she said. Yes, we need the north barn. Yes. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears and everything to do with the particular luminosity that comes over a person's face when something they worked for arrives. We need to tell Caldwell. We need to celebrate first, Silas said, which was, for him, a radical statement. And she knew it, and the corner of her mouth did the precise private thing it did. What does Silas Crowe consider a celebration, she said. I was thinking dinner, he said. A good one. In town if you want. Or here if you'd rather. Here, she said, without hesitation. I don't want to share this evening. He stood up and went to the kitchen and started doing things with the food they had, which he was not gifted at but was willing to attempt. And she sat at the table for another moment with the letter in front of her and her hands on either side of it. Then she folded it carefully and held it for a moment, with her eyes closed, not prayer, just something private, some internal marking of the moment, and put it in the wooden box on the shelf. The same box that held Gideon's letters. She stood up and went to the kitchen and stood beside Silas and said, Move over. You're going to burn the onions. I wasn't going to burn them. You were going to burn them, she said, and moved him aside with her hip, with the casual authority of a woman who had been sharing a kitchen with someone long enough that the geography of it was settled. They made dinner together, badly in places and well enough overall, and they ate it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up against the November dark outside. And they talked about the north barn and the acreage and the women they'd hire and the schedule they'd need to keep. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, in the middle of the practical and the possible, Lenora said quietly, Between one thing and the next, I want to write to Gideon's sister, Kansas. I want to tell her what came of it. Silas looked at her. Of what he started, she said. He never would have called it that, but he started something in that line shack, asking you to come here. I want someone in his family to know that it became something. Silas was quiet for a moment. He thought about Gideon the way he always thought about him, not with the raw grief of the first year, but with something more settled, more like the weight of something permanent, that you've learned to carry without it stopping you. He thought about the line shack and the fire and the stone in his chest and a dying man's request. He'd hate the sentimentality of it, Silas said. He would, Lenora agreed. He'd also want to know. Write to her, Silas said. She nodded. She ate the rest of her dinner. He watched her across the table in the lamplight and thought, not for the first time, but with a clarity that still occasionally ambushed him, that the life he was living was one he would not have had the imagination to invent for himself 2 years ago. He had arrived in Red Willow to fulfill a dying man's request and had expected to manage an obligation. He had not expected partnership. He had not expected to find himself at 41 in a kitchen in Wyoming with a woman who had revised everything he thought he knew about what the word enough meant. He had expected to survive. He had not expected this. Caldwell converted the north barn before the snow came. He did it because the numbers gave him no reason not to, and because Lenora had presented those numbers in his dining room with the same composed precision she brought to every argument that she'd already won before she walked through the door. And because Caldwell was, whatever his other limitations, a man who could read a room when the room was sufficiently well lit by good arithmetic. The work took 3 weeks and required Silas's management at a level that left him arriving home later than usual most evenings, tired in the specific way of someone who has been solving problems all day in the cold. Lenora had dinner waiting some nights and didn't have it other nights, depending on what her own day had demanded. And this had become the natural rhythm of their house, not one person serving another, but 2 people doing what was available to them, given what the day had been, without keeping score of who had done more. He came home one evening in late November to find her at the kitchen table across from Ruth, the young woman, with the careful way of moving. Ruth had her hands folded on the table and her head down slightly, and Lenora was talking in a low, even voice. And Silas read the room in the doorway and went quietly back out through the front entrance and sat on the porch for an hour in the cold, watching the moon rise over the ridge. When he came back in, Ruth was gone. Lenora was at the stove. She didn't explain and he didn't ask. But later, in the quieter part of the evening, she said, she's going to leave. Her situation, she has enough saved now between what I've been paying her and what she'd set aside before. She's going to her sister in Colorado in the spring. Good, Silas said, meaning it fully. She asked me how I knew when to go, Lenora said. When to make the decision. He looked at her. What did you say? I said I waited too long myself. I said I kept thinking the next month would be different. She was quiet for a moment. I said that when you have something to leave for a plan, a direction, something real, that's the time to go. Not when you've run out of strength. Before that. He understood that she was not only talking about Ruth. He understood that she was, in some compressed and careful way, telling him something about the 9 years before he came to Red Willow, about what she'd been surviving and what she'd been waiting for, and the particular courage it required to keep building something when you weren't. Sure, the building was ever going to amount to shelter. You built toward it, he said, even when you didn't know what you were building toward. I knew I wanted to be able to leave if I had to, she said. The sewing, the ledgers. I was building an exit that I ended up not needing to use. Which is its own kind of luck. It's not luck, he said. Luck is what happens to you. That was what you made. She looked at him over her shoulder from the stove. The look lasted a second longer than necessary, which he had learned was her version of a long look. She didn't hold things the way other people did, but she gave them a beat of extra weight when they mattered. You've gotten better, she said, at saying things that are worth saying. I have a good teacher, he said. She turned back to the stove. Don't be charming, she said. It's disorienting. Is it working? She didn't answer that, but the silence had a quality. The north barn was finished in December, and the day they walked through it together, both of them, on a cold morning with their breath showing. The new equipment in place and the space organized according to the processing plan Lenora had designed was the first time Silas understood in a physical way what they had actually built. It was not large by any standard that would have impressed a Denver merchant or an Eastern industrialist. But it was real. It worked. It had been made from an idea that Lenora had walked through with him on a piece of paper at a kitchen table, and now it occupied space in the world and would, in the spring, give wages to 10 women who needed them and skills to those women that they could carry wherever their lives required them to go. Lenora walked the length of the building slowly. She touched the equipment with the careful attention she gave to everything, checking, assessing, making sure the reality matched the plan. At the far end, she stopped and turned and looked back at the whole of it. "It's right," she said, the same words she'd used about the fiber sample in October. Her standard of approval, not it's wonderful or it's perfect, but it's right, which was more demanding and more meaningful than either. "Yes," he said, standing beside her, looking at the same thing, which he was still getting used to, that there was someone beside him to look at things with, that he no longer had to be the only person in the room when something mattered. She slid her hand into his without looking at him, just a quiet lateral movement that had become the language they used for the things that didn't need words. He held it. Outside, December light was doing what December light did in Wyoming, short and clear and bright, the kind of light that made the snow look valuable. The ridge was visible from the barn door, and the field beyond it, empty and snow-covered now, but not finished resting, which was different. In spring, the seed would go in again, more of it, and by summer the blue flowers would be back, and the harvest would follow, and the work would continue in the way of things that have found their proper shape. Ruth would be in Colorado. Other women would take her place. The operation would grow in the incremental, imperfect way of anything real. There would be problems Silas hadn't anticipated, and adjustments Lenora hadn't planned for, and difficult conversations with Caldwell, and difficult seasons, and probably at least one catastrophic redding batch and a market fluctuation or two. Because this was Wyoming, and this was the textile trade, and this was life, which did not offer immunity from difficulty in exchange for effort. But he was not afraid of the difficulty in the way he'd once been. He was afraid of the difficulty in the way of a man who has something worth protecting, a different fear entirely, the fear that comes from having something to lose rather than from having nothing to hold. He tightened his hand around hers slightly. She returned the pressure. "We should name it," she said. "The barn? The operation," she said. "If we're going to be serious about it, we should name it." He thought about it. What would you name it? She was quiet for a moment, looking at what they'd made. Then she said slowly, "Blue Willow linen." For the field and for where it started, he said it to himself the way you test the weight of a word. Blue Willow. Red Willow was where Lenora had spent 9 years building an exit. Blue Willow was where she had decided to stay. "That's right," he said. She squeezed his hand once, and they walked back through the barn and out into the December light. And the cold hit them both at once the way it always did, and neither of them flinched. And that was its own kind of answer to every question the past 2 years had been asking. The second planting went in on a Thursday in late March, 3 times the acreage of the first, and it went in badly. Not the seed itself, the seed was good. Sourced from the same Cheyenne supplier with whom Lenora had negotiated a volume price over the winter, paying less per pound than the first season and getting better quality in exchange, which was the kind of outcome that came from knowing what you were buying rather than hoping. The problem was the ground. A warm spell in February had suggested spring was arriving on schedule, and then March had reversed that suggestion emphatically, and the result was soil that looked workable on the surface and was frozen 2 inches down, which you didn't discover until you were already committed. Silas discovered it on the 4th row. He stopped. He crouched. He put his hand into the turned earth and felt what was there, and stood back up with the expression of a man who has encountered a problem he should have anticipated and didn't, which was a particular kind of frustration, not just at the problem, but at himself for the gap in the planning. "How bad?" Lenora said. She was at the end of the row with the seed allocation chart, wearing her work coat, and the old leather gloves that had outlasted any reasonable expectation of their structural integrity. "We can plant it," he said, "but the germination is going to be slower, and the early roots are going to work harder than they should." "Kill it? No, but it'll cost us 2 weeks, maybe 3. She looked at the field, 15 acres of prepared ground, 3 times what they'd had last year, with the north barn staffed and Farwell expecting a delivery volume that required a full and healthy season. She did the math that he was also doing, and the math came out the same way for both of them, which was workable but not comfortable. "We plant it," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." "You wanted to be frustrated for a moment." "Yes." "Fair enough," she said. "Are you done?" He picked up his work and went back to the row. She went back to the chart. They planted it, all 15 acres. Over 3 days of hard work with 6 people, including Silas, Dooley, Roy, and 3 of the women from the processing building who had asked to help and had not been asked why they'd asked, because the answer was obvious. They had skin in this too, wages in this, futures adjacent to this, and the line between employer and employee had never been as sharp at Blue Willow as it was in most operations. That was Lenora's doing. Not by policy, not by any stated philosophy, but by the cumulative effect of how she ran things, the way she explained decisions rather than just issuing them, the way she asked questions of the women she trained and actually used their answers, the way she had built the operations procedures from documented trial and error that was visible to everyone rather than from authority that nobody was allowed to question. It created a particular kind of loyalty, the kind that doesn't come from fear or even from gratitude, but from the rarer thing of people feeling that their intelligence is being respected. Silas had watched this happen gradually over the winter months as the barn filled up and the work routines established themselves, and the women who worked there stopped moving like people auditioning for a position they weren't sure they'd keep, started moving like people who knew their own value in a room. He had no language for how much this cost Lenora the constant attention, the management of conflicts, the patience required to train properly rather than just get the task done, but he knew it was expensive, and he tried to account for it in the practical ways available to him, which mostly meant making sure that the parts of their shared life that he could carry alone, he carried. She noticed. She didn't mention it often, but occasionally in the way she had of acknowledging things sideways rather than directly the way she'd told him she was glad he came. The way she'd said, "We have time in the kitchen," she would say something that made clear she'd been watching what he did, as carefully as he'd been watching what she did, and that the watching had accumulated into something she carried with her. The problem with Hartwell came in April. Silas had been aware of Hartwell peripherally all winter. The man existed at the edge of the operation's life, the way a persistent weather condition exists at the edge of a season. Not central enough to require direct attention, but present enough to create a low background irritation. Hartwell had been wrong about the sewing shop lasting the month, wrong about the flax experiment, wrong about Lenora's capacity to manage anything larger than a needle and thread, and being repeatedly wrong had not made him more thoughtful. It had made him defensive in the particular way of people whose identity is built on a version of reality that reality has stopped cooperating with. What Hartwell did in April was file a formal complaint with Edmund Caldwell, alleging that Blue Willow Linen was operating an unlicensed commercial enterprise on Caldwell's property without proper territorial business registration, which was partially accurate in a technical sense. The paperwork that should have been completed the previous autumn had been delayed by the convergence of the harvest, the Farwell negotiation, and the barn conversion, and had not been filed on schedule. It was not a large problem legally. It was the kind of oversight that a letter and a fee to the territorial administration would resolve in 2 weeks. The problem was the timing. Hartwell had filed the complaint through a territorial office contact he had, and the filing had triggered a temporary hold on the operation's ability to enter into new commercial contracts, which meant the expansion of the Farwell arrangement that Lenora had been negotiating for the second season was now paused pending resolution. Caldwell told them on a Tuesday morning with the expression of a man delivering bad news he doesn't fully understand, but is taking seriously because someone told him to. He sat at his dining room table with the complaint document in front of him and said, "I need this resolved quickly." Farwell is expecting confirmation by end of month. Lenora read the document. She read it twice, and Silas watched her face during the reading, not for the emotion, which she managed carefully in rooms like this, but for the understanding that came through in small ways. The slight shift in her expression when she reached a key passage, the way her eyes tracked back to reread something. She set the document down. "This is Hartwell," she said. "The complaint came through a legitimate channel," Caldwell said carefully. "The complaint is legitimate," she said. "The oversight was real and should have been caught earlier. I'm not disputing that." She tapped the document. "I'm noting who initiated it and why, which is relevant to whether this is a good faith compliance concern or a targeted inconvenience." Caldwell looked uncomfortable. "Whatever the motivation." "Whatever the motivation, yes," she said. "We file the registration today, pay the fee, and send a written response to the territorial office with the documentation of our operation. The hold should lift within 10 days if the response is thorough." She looked at Silas. "I need the operating records from the first season and the barn conversion permits." "Do you have copies?" "At home," he said. "Can you have them by this afternoon?" "I can have them by noon." She turned back to Caldwell. "I'll need use of your desk and access to the county recorder's office in town. I'd like to handle the correspondence myself." Caldwell, who had come into this meeting expecting to manage a difficult situation, found himself instead managing the experience of watching it be managed for him. "Of course," he said. She filed the registration that afternoon. She submitted the written response to the territorial office the following morning. The response was 14 pages, which was 11 more than the office typically received in response to routine compliance holds, and contained documentation so complete that the reviewing officer in Cheyenne later told a colleague that it was the most organized first-year operation filing he'd processed in a decade, which was not information that ever made it back to Hartwell. The hold lifted in 8 days. Lenora sent the confirmation to Farwell and continued the expansion negotiation where it had paused, and the contract for the second season was signed before end of month. She did not discuss Hartwell further. She did not file any countercomplaint or take any action that could be characterized as retaliatory. She simply completed the work, documented it properly, and moved forward. Silas, watching all of this, thought about what it required of a person to be wronged in a petty and deliberate way, and to respond not with the satisfaction of confrontation, but with the discipline of not giving the wrong thing more of your energy than it deserved. He thought about how many times Lenora had done this in some form over the years before he'd known her. How many times she had been the target of someone's need to diminish her and had chosen to spend her response on building rather than fighting. He brought it up that evening. "Hartwell," he said. "I know," she said. "You're not angry." "I'm angry," she said. "I'm just not spending it on him. There's a difference." "Where are you spending it?" She looked up from what she was reading. "On the work," she said, "where it does something." He nodded. He understood this, or was beginning to. The anger that went into the work rather than into the confrontation, the anger that became force rather than friction. He had spent his life managing anger by suppressing it, which was not the same thing and was considerably less efficient. "You're better at this than I am," he said. "At which part?" "Deciding what deserves your energy." She considered this. "I had more practice at it," she said. "I had to learn it because the alternative was spending every year being destroyed by people who weren't worth the destruction." She paused. "You learned something different. You learned to not need anything, so there was nothing to take." "Yes," he said. "That kept you safe," she said. "It also kept you." She stopped. "Adjusted smaller than you are," she said. "Not permanently." But for a long time, he absorbed that without defending against it, which was something he'd been practicing. "And now," he said, She looked at him with the directness that was the most characteristic thing about her, the look that went all the way to what it was looking for without detour. "Now you're building something," she said, "which means you need things. Which means things can be taken." She held his gaze. "I think you're learning to be okay with that." "I'm learning," he said. "I'm not there yet." "I know," she said. "Neither am I, about different things. We're working on it at the same time, which seems right for us." Ruth wrote in May from Colorado. The letter was addressed to Lenora, which was appropriate, and Lenora read it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with her coffee, while Silas read his own correspondence across from her. He saw her face change while she read, not dramatically, but in the way he'd learned to read, the small adjustments that meant something had landed. She put the letter down. "She's well," she said. "She found work. Her sister's husband helped her get a position at a dry goods operation in Boulder." "Good," Silas said. She says Lenora looked at the letter again. "She says the money she earned at Blue Willow was what made it possible. That she left with enough to not need anyone's permission. She was quiet for a moment. That's what she said. Not anyone's permission." Silas said nothing. He let it be what it was. Lenora folded the letter and held it for a moment, and he could see her thinking about the distance between what she'd set out to build and what it had become that the business she'd proposed to Caldwell on 5 acres of western pasture had, in the course of 2 years, become a route out for a woman who'd needed one, a source of wages for 10 others, a reason for the county's neighboring ranches to start looking at their unused pasture differently, and a conversation between a woman from Red Willow and a textile merchant in Denver that had changed the financial geometry of an entire rural operation. None of that had been in the original proposal. None of it had been planned. It had grown the way the flax had grown from the right conditions, tended with the right attention into something larger than the seed suggested. She put the letter in the wooden box. There were 3 letters in there now, Gideon's, and the letter from his sister in Kansas that she'd written to in November, and now Ruth's. The box was becoming a record of something, though Lenora would not have used that word. She would have said it was just letters. But Silas, who had watched her put each one in with the same careful deliberateness, understood that she was keeping track of what mattered and calling it by a practical name because the real name was harder to say. The summer of the second season was different from the first, in the way that second times are always different, less frightened, more skilled, and in some ways harder, because the expectations were higher, and the margin for the kind of learning that failure allows had narrowed. The 15 acres grew, not as fast as the first season, the frozen ground in March leaving a delay that played out through May and into June. And there were 3 weeks in midsummer when Silas watched the weather and did the calendar math and said nothing to Lenora about what he was calculating, which she noticed and didn't push on because she was doing the same calculation and reaching the same uncertain conclusion. But Wyoming summers are long when they're good, and this one was good, and by late July the field had made up most of the time it had lost, and the crop was moving toward harvest with the momentum of something that had decided to cooperate. The blue flowers came back in force, more of them this time across the wider acreage. And on the morning that Lenora stood at the edge of the field and looked at 15 acres of blue, she was quiet for so long that Silas, standing beside her, simply waited. "My grandfather would have liked this," she finally said. "Tell me about him," Silas said. He realized, as he said it, that in 2 years he had learned most of what he knew about her by this method, not by asking direct questions, but by finding the sideways entries, the stories that came attached to moments. She opened differently through moments than through direct inquiry, which was not weakness, but a different architecture of trust. He was a stubborn man, she said, very sure of what he knew and fairly wrong about half of it, but he knew how to grow things. He said that the difference between a farmer and a man who plants seeds is that the farmer stays. She looked at the field. I used to think that meant physically, staying in the place. But I think he meant something harder than that, staying with the idea even when the ground is frozen. staying with the work even when it looks like nothing's happening. "You've done that," Silas said. "We've done it," she said, without looking at him, but with the particular weight that came when she used that word "we," which she did not use carelessly and never had. He looked at the field. 15 acres of blue against Wyoming sky in late July, everything they'd bet on and worked for and fought for visible all at once in a single morning. He thought about the line shack. He thought about a dying man's voice and a stone in his chest and a woman in a sewing shop who hadn't flinched from his first look. He thought about breakfast conversations and ledger pages and a 3-second moment in a kitchen that had changed something permanent. He thought that the thing Gideon had asked him to do and the thing he had actually done were so different from each other that the original request was almost unrecognizable in the outcome. Gideon had asked him to give Lenora a home. What had actually happened was that they had given each other something that neither of them had possessed before, which was the particular freedom that comes from being genuinely known by someone who has chosen to stay anyway. He had come here to fulfill an obligation. He had found instead the one thing he'd spent 40 years telling himself he didn't need and had simply been wrong about. Farwell came back in September of the second year, and this time he brought someone with him. The someone was a woman named Charlotte Price, who represented a collective of Eastern women's textile cooperatives and who had heard about Blue Willow linen through Farwell's network and had asked to see it for herself. She was a tall, serious woman in her 40s who had the bearing of someone accustomed to being underestimated and had stopped being polite about it some years ago. She and Lenora sat across from each other in the processing barn for 2 hours, while Farwell and Silas stood outside and talked about cattle prices, which was what men talked about when the actual business was happening somewhere they weren't needed. Silas didn't know what was said in those 2 hours. Lenora told him parts of it that evening, in the way she summarized important conversations, giving him the shape of it rather than the transcript, the conclusions rather than the path to them. What Charlotte Price wanted, it turned out, was not a supplier relationship, but a knowledge exchange. She wanted Lenora to document the Blue Willow processing method in enough detail that 3 cooperatives in the East could implement it with local fiber sources. And she was prepared to pay for that documentation as a consulting arrangement. "She wants to pay you to write down what you know," Silas said. "Yes, how much?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's yes," she said, "it is. What did you say?" "I said I needed to think about it." She looked at him. "I need to think about whether we want the method widely known. It's our competitive advantage. If 3 Eastern cooperatives are running the same process." "Can they get Wyoming flax?" he said. She paused. "No. The climate's wrong for it at Eastern scale. Then the process is not your only advantage," he said. "The fiber source is Wyoming specific. You can share the method and keep the market." She looked at him with the expression that meant he'd just said something worth adding to her calculation. "That's correct," she said slowly. "I hadn't gotten there yet." "You'd have gotten there," he said. "Probably tonight," she agreed. "But you saved me the trip." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to take the arrangement, with some modifications to the documentation terms." "Of course," he said. She wrote back to Charlotte Price the following week with a counterproposal. Price accepted it. The consulting arrangement was formalized before October. And Lenora Vane Lenora Crowe, who had built her trade in Red Willow from a sewing shop that half the town expected to fail, who had found accounting errors in a ranch ledger by accident and turned that accident into a profession, who had planted 5 acres of flax in frozen ground on a gamble and stayed with the idea through every reason not to become, in the autumn of 1881, the person that 3 Eastern textile cooperatives paid to teach them what she knew. Hartwell closed his mercantile in November. Not because of Blue Willow specifically, though Blue Willow's success had contributed to a shift in the county's commercial center of gravity that had not been kind to businesses predicated on being the only option. He closed it because his lease was up, and the building's owner wanted a higher rate, and Hartwell didn't have the margin to absorb it. which was a business problem of the ordinary kind, and nothing to do with any of the things he'd spent the past 2 years being wrong about. He left Red Willow quietly. Nobody made a production of it. Lenora, when Silas told her, said, "I hope he finds something better suited to him." She said it without irony and meant it, which Silas found remarkable in the way he still found many things about her remarkable the absence of the hunger for vindication that would have been fully understandable given everything. "You don't want him to have had it harder," Silas said. "No," she said. "What would that give me that I don't already have?" He had no answer for that because it was not a question that needed answering. In December, on the evening of their second anniversary, not the wedding date, but the date Lenora had said yes in the sewing shop, which was the date they'd both privately decided mattered more, Silas came home to find the wooden box on the kitchen table. She was sitting across from it with a cup of tea, not looking at it, looking out the window at the dark yard and the lit outline of the north barn against the winter sky. He sat down. He looked at the box. He looked at her. "I was thinking about Gideon," she said. "I think about him more this time of year." "So do I." She put her hand on the lid of the box without opening it. "Can I tell you something about what I thought when I first got his letter? The letter where he told me he'd asked a friend to come in his place?" "Yes," Silas said. "I was furious," she said. "I was so angry that I burned the first draft of my response because it was not a letter I wanted anyone to find after my death. I was angry because I'd believed him. I'd built something around the idea of what he was promising. And then he was dead, and I was being offered a substitute, as if I were a problem to be managed." She paused. "I wrote to you because of the last line of his letter, not the rest of it." "What did it say?" He said, "Silas Crowe keeps his word. I have never known him not to. Whatever you decide, he will honor it." She looked at Silas. "I'd been lied to by people who promised things. And Gideon, who was dying, spent part of his last letter telling me that his friend was a man who kept his word." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't know if I believed it, but I needed to find out." And he said, "And you kept your word," she said. "Every single one of them." He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm, and the barn light was visible through the window, and 2 years of a life they had built from an impossible starting point were arranged around them in the ordinary evidence of shared living, the coffee cups in the right places, the ledgers on the shelf, the coat she'd repaired for him hanging on the hook by the door. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I rode to Red Willow," he said, "I told myself I was coming because of the debt to Gideon, because I owed him, because a man keeps his word to a dying friend." He looked at the table. "But there was a night, about a week before I left, where I read his letters about you, the ones he'd written to me, describing you, and I sat with them for a long time." He looked up at her. "I came because of the debt, but I stayed the first day, the first week, the decision to actually go through with it that wasn't obligation. That was something else. I was afraid to call it what it was." "What was it?" she said, quietly, not pressing, just making space. "Hope," he said, "which I hadn't had in a long time, and which scared me considerably more than anything else I can name." The word sat between them in the kitchen. She reached across the table and opened the box. She took out Gideon's letters not to read them, but to hold them, the weight of the paper in her hands. Then she put them back. She put the lid back on, and she looked at Silas across the kitchen table with the eyes that were older than the rest of her face and said, "I think he knew what he was doing. I think he knew you better than you knew yourself, and he knew me better than I gave him credit for, and he matched us deliberately." "That sounds like him," Silas said. "Infuriating man," she said, with the specific tone that meant she was, in the most complicated way, grateful. Silas looked at her. He thought about the line shack and the blizzard and a dying man's voice asking for one more thing. He thought about how many times the future had arrived in a form he hadn't recognized until he was already inside it. He thought that the most important things in his life had come not from plans he'd made, but from promises he'd kept and doors he'd walked through, even when the reason for walking through them wasn't yet clear. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. 2 years, he said. 2 years, she said. Is it what you expected? She thought about it seriously, as she thought about everything. No, she said. It's harder than I expected, and better than I knew how to expect because I didn't have a frame for it. She looked at him. Is it what you expected? I expected to manage an obligation, he said. I got a partner, a business I didn't know I was going to care about, a life I didn't have the imagination to plan. He paused. And you, which is none of what I expected and all of what I needed, which I realize sounds like something on a sampler, but is just the plain fact. She laughed, the real one, the genuine one that still arrived like a small surprise even now. You're getting better at saying things, she said. I have a good teacher, he said. She's been working on it for 2 years. She stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the barn and the dark field beyond it and the ridge above everything, and Silas stayed in his chair and watched her, which was something he'd been doing for 2 years, watching her think, watching her work through things, watching her be the specific and irreplaceable person she was in every room she occupied. She turned around. Come look at this, she said. He got up and came to stand beside her. The north barn was lit from inside, warmth showing at the edges of the door because one of the women had stayed late to finish a fiber batch before the cold fully set in. The yard was snow-covered, and the field was invisible under it, but present, resting, storing up what it would need for spring. The ridge was dark against a sky that had more stars than a man could count in a lifetime of looking. It's ours, she said, not possessively, factually. The way she stated things that were simply true and worth naming. It is, he said. She leaned against his shoulder, not dramatically, not with any ceremony, just the small lateral shift of a body that has decided where it is most comfortable. He put his arm around her, which had always fit from the first time he'd done it in an awkward reach across the space between their horses on an August evening, and they stood at the window and looked at what they'd made. Outside, the Wyoming winter was doing what Wyoming winters do, which is to say it was serious and cold and entirely indifferent to the small warm light of a ranch house window and the 2 people inside it. In the spring the seed would go in again. The women would come back to work. Farwell would want his delivery confirmation. Charlotte Price's cooperatives would send their questions. Caldwell would have opinions about expansion. Roy would break something expensive and feel bad about it. Dooley would say something that required interpretation. The ground would be frozen on the wrong morning, and something would not go as planned, because nothing worthwhile proceeded entirely as planned. And the managing of that, the staying with it, the adjusting and reprocessing and planting again was the work. It was always going to be the work. Lenora had understood this from the beginning. Silas had learned it from her, which was one of the most significant educations of his life. He thought about Gideon, as he often did, and he thought that the debt was paid in full, and then some paid beyond anything Gideon had thought to ask for, beyond the simple protection of a woman who needed a home, into something larger and truer than either of them would have known to want. Gideon had asked him to give Lenora security. What they had given each other was harder to name than security, and worth considerably more. He was a man who had spent 40 years surviving. He had not understood until now how different surviving was from living, how much you could go through the motions of a life while keeping the parts of yourself most worth living, for locked away from anything that could touch them. He had been safe. He had been alone. He had called those the same thing. He did not call them the same thing anymore. Lenora was quiet beside him at the window. Not the wary quiet of the early months, the quiet of 2 people still learning how much space to give each other. This was the other kind, the settled kind, the kind that doesn't need anything added to it. She said, after a while, we should sleep. The morning comes early. It always does, he said. She stepped away from the window and went to put out the lamp on the table, and he stayed a moment longer, looking out at the field and the ridge and the barn light. He thought, this is the thing Gideon gave me by asking the impossible. Not a task, not an obligation, a direction, and all he'd had to do was keep walking in it and keep his word and be willing to be surprised by what was there when he arrived. He turned away from the window and went to find her, and the house was warm around him, and the night was cold outside, and none of what he had would have been possible if he had kept doing what was safe instead of what was right. He was glad every day now that he had stopped knowing the difference.